Welcome back. All right. I want to talk about the NHL's point system today. I haven't talked about the NHL's point system in a long time. And I haven't seen the discussion yet this year. So I figured before we have that discussion, before people start talking about it, let's go ahead and get ahead of it. And so what I've got on the board here is all the teams arranged by where they are in the standings. In black, those are their current points totals. In red, those are the number of overtime or shootout loss points that these teams have accumulated already. And in purple, that's what the teams would have if a regulation win counted for 3 points. I feel like it has to be pointed out, though, before somebody else points it out to me in the comment section. We don't play in that system right now. Teams are not playing for 3 points in regulation. If there was 3 points in regulation right now, these numbers might look completely different. Teams might be pulling the goalie in a tie game to try to get extra points, that kind of thing, right? So where now you see teams just, sitting back playing for the point, maybe you would see teams going for the attack, looking for those 3 points in regulation, knowing the other team won't get any. But the NHL, I don't think, has any interest in making that change. The NHL's current system is set up so that no team looks like they're really that far out. So again, all I changed was a regulation win from 2 points to 3. And what it does is interesting because the Rangers go from 23 points to 34 because they have 11 regulation wins. The Islanders only have 4 regulation wins, so they go from 18 to 22. So that difference between them and the Rangers goes from 5 points to 12. Now, with regulation wins being 3 points, it does mean that for the Islanders, in theory, it's easier to catch up if they get some regulation wins, but they're 12 points back in that system. In the Atlantic Division, it tightens up a little bit. Boston's above the line with 24 points. Ottawa has 23. Buffalo has 23, as mentioned. The Islanders, Philly, and Detroit would all have 22. Interestingly enough, Montreal would move up. They'd have 23 points as well if regulation wins counted for 3 points. But who's in the playoffs? It's the same 8 teams. And it's in roughly the same order. And I say roughly because at this point, again, with games in hand and everything being as it is, obviously you're not going to stop the season today and go, well, that's it. So these teams with more points are in. These teams with better points percentages, better luck next year. But it doesn't make this dramatic change with what we see right now. But for the NHL to see how it would change things, they'd have to have an appetite to change things. And they don't. Now, the reason I'm wearing an Islanders jersey is because in terms of overtime and shootout loss points, they lead the league with 4. And the Islanders get to overtime frequently. The Islanders are in overtime a lot during the regular season last year and this year. And I'm honestly a little bit surprised with how much overtime they play and how many close games they get in. That their playoff record over the last couple of appearances hasn't been better. Just because you would think they play all these close games, all these tight games, they should be set for playoff hockey, but they've ended up against opponents that just had more talent and were able to outlast them. Now out west, the difference between Colorado and Utah in the Central Division, Colorado's 3 points ahead. If you made 3 points for regulation wins a reality, Colorado is then 7 points ahead of the Utah Hockey Club. And then in the Pacific Division, Calgary stays above the line. They move 2 points ahead of Edmonton. Right now, they're 1 point ahead of Edmonton. And again, the overtime loss points, San Jose has 4 of them. They only have 3 regulation wins. So they go from being 4 points out of the playoffs to being 8 points out of the playoffs if you make that change. And this is part of the reason why the idea of going to three points for regulation win probably wouldn't interest the NHL. The NHL loves to sell us on the idea that these teams are all close. That these teams are all, they're all in the hunt, they're all in the running. And anytime I talk about teams and I say I don't think they're going to make the playoffs, there will be that pushback of, hey, anything can happen and they're only, X amount of points back. Without taking into account how many teams you have to jump past to get to the playoffs, that those teams need to be playing worse than your team is. And it just usually at this time of year, whoever's in the playoffs, we end up seeing them in the playoffs. And of course, we have that discussion at American Thanksgiving too. We'll have that discussion at American Thanksgiving again this year. And I can say American Thanksgiving because I'm Canadian and we had Thanksgiving last month, so it counts. But yeah, it's one of those things that I think people want to make it so that it feels more fair. So going back to last year, the Washington Capitals make the playoffs over Detroit. And there was a lot of, but why? Because regulation wins are considered to be the tiebreaker. So regulation wins got Washington into the playoffs. And I would argue that with the way things are going this year, Washington was the right team to make the playoffs last spring. Regulation wins, maybe it told us something because Washington currently has 39 points. Detroit, or 27 points. I'm looking at the wrong column. 27 points. Detroit's sitting at 16. Ottawa's at 17. Philadelphia's at 18. Apparently, Washington was the best of those teams. Or at the very least, getting into the playoffs has helped get them to where they are right now, where they made the right moves in the offseason. They didn't necessarily feel the pressure to sell, which if they'd missed the playoffs, maybe they would have. That would have been back-to-back years outside the playoffs, and there would have been a lot of discussion about, players getting older and are they good enough. But as a result of getting in, because of that tiebreaker, I would argue that it's probably helped the Washington Capitals for this season. But the NHL wants to sell us on parity. And one thing that these overtime and shootout loss points do, it does even things out. It means you'll see like Boston has 3 of these points, so that puts them 2 points ahead of Ottawa and Buffalo, who only have 1 overtime or shootout loss point. It puts them 3 points ahead of Detroit, who only have 2 of them, and puts them 3 points ahead of Montreal, who also only have 2 overtime or shootout loss points. But there's not really an appetite to do what I would ask either, which would be just bring back ties. That's honestly how I would feel is get rid of the overtime loss point. Still play 3-on-3 in overtime, sure. I guess, sure, why not? But I prefer 3 columns that are wins, losses, and ties. It is weird when I'm doing career videos and it spans, if it's a goalie video, and realizing, okay, these are ties and then these aren't. And it just doesn't look right to me. It's weird to say, well, and then they had these overtime and shootout loss points. And again, it's probably because I'm old. I know there's a lot of things because I'm old, but I do remember when it was win, losses, and ties. I'm old enough to remember when there was an overtime, where you would watch teams and you go, well, it's a tie game, good, and all right, each team gets a point. Yeah, I'm happy with that tie. And then the NHL realized they had too many of them, and they did. It was getting pretty ridiculous just how many games were tied, which again you can use to point out parity. But the reality is that there's not as much parity in the league, I don't think anyways, as the standings might tell you. I think there's some very good teams in the league, and as I've mentioned in videos already this year, I think there's a lot of teams that are kind of mediocre. There are some teams that are kind of bad too. I don't think there's any teams that are just absolutely egregiously awful, but I think there's some bad teams, there's some mediocre teams, and then there's some very good teams. And if the league was really truly parity, we would be talking about how anybody could beat anybody on any given night, which we've discussed before, and there's some truth to it on some level, but the reality is usually quite different. Where, yes, you're going to have the occasional upset here and there, but the best teams are usually the best teams. So the West, you'd still have Winnipeg as the best team with 42 points. Vegas, 34 points. So Vegas would be 8 points back of Winnipeg. They're 6 points back now because they've also got 2 overtime loss and shootout loss points. Winnipeg has none. So one thing that's always kind of irritated me is when a team has more wins than another in the standings, but they lost all their games in regulation. So they're beneath a team that actually won fewer games, but they lost some games in shootouts and overtime, so they got all those extra points. It is something that has irritated me since they brought in that system. It has irritated me the whole way. The thing is, again, I don't think that the NHL has any intention of ever changing it. I think they're happy with the point system as it is. I think it's a discussion we can have as fans till the cows come home, and we will. We'll be having this discussion for years. But we've never heard anything from the GM meetings about wanting to change anything. We've heard about them wanting to extend overtime so that we get fewer shootouts. My answer is let's just get rid of the shootout. But it's been in the league for so long now that I think there's a lot of fans that just kind of accept it as being part of the game, or they've grown up with it, and so the idea of getting rid of a shootout might seem crazy and radical. Whereas I think it would just it makes sense, because to me a shootout is just a skills competition. It's just a breakaway contest. And I don't take it any more seriously than when I'm watching a soccer game and it goes to penalty kicks. I understand why soccer games go to penalty kicks. They could play for days and nobody would score a goal. But it's hard for me because when I see the penalty kicks in soccer, the winning team, I'm like, I mean, they won, but the other team, they didn't allow anything, and now they're going home because they didn't hit that penalty shot. It's just weird to me. It's weird, and it feels like when you're playing a team sport that the teams on the ice or on the field or whatever should decide the winner playing the game the way the game's normally played. Which means that, yeah, if your argument's going to be, well, if you're going to do that, you'd have to get rid of 3-on-3 overtime. All right, fine. But there's no appetite for this. I haven't seen anything from the NHLPA. I've never seen anything from the NHL saying that they want to change the system, other than maybe extending overtime, which the NHLPA would have to agree with. And also, with team flights, charter flights being as they are, I don't know that they would want things to necessarily go longer than they already do because they don't want to, be messing around with flights and all that. They just want to get it done, get out, and get ready for the next one. So the idea of having 3 points for a win, and if you want to do 3-2-1, you can. I didn't do that because there's not enough shootouts and overtime games at this point to necessarily make any difference if you're only including 1 point for a shootout win. But what's interesting too is that right now the NHL's on pace by my calculations for 264 of what I call the loser point. Other people don't like that term. No, they got that point for being tied after regulation, stupid hockey guy. But that's about 8.25 per team. As you can see, some teams don't have any and other teams have 4. So that means that the Islanders, instead of being 12 points back of the Carolina Hurricanes, they're 8 points back, which makes it sound like they're a lot closer than I think they are in reality, right? As long as you can keep it to single digits, people can say, well, they're only 7 points back. Well, they're only 8 points back. So I think there's a chance. There's only, and then when it becomes double digits and beyond, people go, well, and that the other side you could look at for this is the NHL might like this because they might feel like it helps with attendance, where teams can say, hey, we're only 7 points back. Montreal's only 3 points back because it is Boston, so there's that. But yeah, it is an interesting setup that the NHL has where they can sell hope. They can sell hope to all 32 teams right now. It might be harder to sell in some markets than others, but when there's no teams that are 10 points back, and I think if we went to a system where we didn't have overtime and shootout points and all of that, I think we would see greater separation between teams. My dream has always been to have hockey, basically the wins and losses look the same as baseball. So you would have a team at the end of the year, they're 42-40, 84 points. You're very likely to be a playoff team. And, if a team wins 50 games, it goes 50-32 on the season, that means something if you did it that way. But again, the NHL I don't think is ever going to do it that way. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. As always, again, the NHL, there's no reason to think they're ever going to change the point system, but I'd be interested to know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And again, I didn't go through and really toy around with this so much because we don't play in a system where teams get 3 points for regulation win. And I think if we did, these numbers would be different. But thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.